Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out to Flyleaf Books tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore, as well as this wonderful author. Your attendance and book purchases allow us to host events like this, and we really love to do it, so I appreciate it. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from David Daley about his new book, ANTIDEMOCRATIC, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. This event will be with Billy Courier of the People's Parody Project. Also behind me. David Daley is the author of the national bestseller Rat Fuck.
All right.
Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for helping kickstart the movement to reform gerrymandering. His journalism has been published by The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, among other publications. So I will turn this over to Billy and David now, but remember you can get the book up front if you have not already, and we can do more signing after the talk as well.
Hello, everybody. I thank you, Billy. I thank you, Flyleaf. What a thrill to be back here in Chapel Hill, where I went to grad school 30 years ago. It does not seem possible, but it's great to see so many friends here tonight. It's been a long time. We were supposed to do Flyleaf on the last book, and March of 2020 got in the way of that, so it's wonderful to get a chance to be here. Billy and I will do this in conversation tonight, so you won't have to endure a 35-minute diatribe about John Roberts and Balls and Strikes. But this is, in some ways, and gosh, thank you for saying rat fucked, because not everybody does. And in many ways, this book is a companion piece. It's sort of the second part of the story, because if Rat Fucked was trying to tell the story about how Republicans put their hands on one of the pressure points in our democracy that sometimes flies under the radar in state legislatures in order to achieve bigger power. They played Moneyball in a lot of ways, if you know that the Michael Lewis book, of course, about the Oakland A's, and sort of recognized that this was someplace that people hadn't thought about, that if you took over state legislatures, redistricted yourself into power, you could then do all kinds of things without having to worry about those pesky voters. And what this book tries to tell is, when you have done a similar project to capture the courts, those two things can work together in really complicated ways, I think, as you probably experience here in North Carolina almost every day. And if you care about the future of our democracy, as I know we all here do, you have to fundamentally care about the state of the courts. Conservatives have had a long plan to make this happen. In many ways, this is a backlash that's been brewing ever since the Warren Court. It's a backlash that's been brewing ever since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We like to imagine that launched a halcyon era, but the state of South Carolina was in court about a month after its passage, trying to say that it was a violation of state sovereignty. It simply took John Roberts until 2013 to agree. The Chief Justice has been deeply involved in these efforts for a long time. As a very young man, his first job in Washington, D.C., working in the Reagan Department of Justice, he's 26, 27 years old. He is from a wealthy Indiana enclave on the waterfront across from Chicago. He likes to pass that off as sort of Indiana farmland out of a John Cougar Mellencamp song, but it is not. It is a very exclusive community, effectively a gated community that, decades after federal housing discrimination laws were passed, this town was still advertising itself as for Caucasian Gentiles only. This is where he grows up. And this is the guy who at 26 years old is handed the Justice Department's portfolio over voting rights, something he really doesn't know anything about and has never had to fight for at all. So he leads the way in opposition to the reauthorization of the congressional version of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, and loses that fight. But there was a really valuable lesson that was learned there by the conservative legal movement, which was, you don't need 218 members of the House, you don't need 51 senators or a president if you can get 5 people on the court. And all the better if one of those 5 is Roberts himself. So this in many ways has been his life's work. He has created a mythology around himself as a genial caller of balls and strikes. It couldn't be further from the truth. He is in many ways the most effective Republican politician of his generation. He has delivered victory after victory for conservatives, for the conservative legal movement, that never could have been won at the ballot box, whether we're talking about gun control or voting rights or abortion rights, whether we're talking about the immunity decision that just came down, a war on the regulatory state, on the administrative state. These are all decisions that conservatives have worked for and longed for, but have been unable to actually win. And Roberts, from 2005 through 2024, has very profoundly moved the country and the Constitution in his direction, in I think, serious and disturbingly anti-democratic ways. And we are coming up on an election in which it's very, very possible that a close race ends up back at the U.S. Supreme Court. I think probably many of us in this room lived through Bush versus Gore in 2000. And I think we all learned in 2020 about the importance of those weeks in between an election and a certification, and then finally the meeting of the Electoral College in mid-December. And those 5 weeks could be deeply, deeply complicated. If they are successful in grinding certification to a halt and in closing some of these things down, let's say the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania agrees to keep lines open an extra couple of hours because people are still lined up on voting night, and the court decides to revisit the independent state legislative theory as a result of this. There's a million different scenarios that we can imagine in which this finds its way back to this court, in which you've got a 6-person conservative supermajority, largely handpicked by Leonard Leo, chosen by 5 of them, chosen by presidents who lost the popular vote, 3 of them who were lawyers who worked on the Bush versus Gore case. So I think we certainly have to worry that we're going to have an election on November 5th, and 180 million of us are going to vote. And there's still a pretty good chance that it could come down to those 6 and those 9 really making this decision. So now that I have thoroughly taken the room down to my own bummed out level, I'm going to turn it over to Billy.
No, thanks, David. I think that's a very dire warning, but one that I think we all should be heeding as we head into this election coming up. And I guess I want to kind of talk a little bit about some of the ways that we've been rat-fucked here in North Carolina, in ways that you talked about. I'm sure folks are very aware that our legislature is very fond of gerrymandering our elections. And we've seen them pass all kinds of voter suppression bills, voter ID bill that's going to be in effect for the first time this year. And in 2013, I think, was probably the most notorious example of voter suppression. Y'all might remember that the legislature passed a bill that was later struck down because it had targeted black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. Basically, we had state legislators going through data from the DMV about, which IDs were possessed by black people, which IDs were possessed by white people. And they intentionally crafted this law to try and disenfranchise black people. And it wasn't just the ID part. There was also like cuts to early voting. They ended pre-registration for teenagers. A lot of other voter suppression measures in this bill. And if that had happened in, a couple of years earlier, the federal government may have actually been able to do something about that. But as it was, they didn't. Well, the courts actually intervened a couple years later, and a lot of the most problematic provisions of that bill were finally struck down. But the bill never would have happened, I think, if not for the Shelby County case, which I think was written by John Roberts, right?
Allow me to blame John Roberts for that too.
Absolutely. But soon after that case came out, a state legislator came out and said, okay, now we don't have to worry about the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act anymore. We can just do whatever we want, basically.
We can unleash the monster, I think was what he said.
Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit about the Shelby County case and how it really paved the way for some of this voter suppression that we've seen, not just in North Carolina, but so many states today?
Shelby County versus Holder needs to be on the list of the most disastrous decisions that the court has ever handed down. And it's disastrous for so many reasons, in part because John Roberts simply makes up the entire rationale. It's completely phony. He judges this based on a what he calls a traditional standard of equal sovereignty among states, which doesn't exist. He confuses this with the equal footing doctrine that governs the admission of states to the Union, and he applies it to voting rights by simply cutting out the part of this in the middle that makes clear it has nothing to do with anything other than the admission of states to the Union. He uses an ellipsis and just smashes it out. I've got all the language in the book. It's really kind of stunning. So when people assume that sometimes these guys are making laws based on their own partisan desires, sometimes they're just making up the law based on their own partisan desires. That's even worse. But Roberts' sense in 2013, when Shelby comes down, is that things have changed in the South, and that preclearance, which had been the most effective enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act, which effectively put states that had the worst history of racial voting suppression on probation. If they wanted to make any changes to their laws, they had to run them by the Department of Justice or a 3-judge court in Washington first. And this worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked really well. It caught the most egregious examples. It made people think twice about doing terrible things. And when Congress reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act in 2006 by a margin of 390 to 33 in the House, 98 to nothing in the Senate, and it's signed into law by George W. Bush, it comes with a 16,000-page congressional record laying out example after example from all of these states where it's in effect as to why it is still needed. Elections that were canceled at the last second when it looked as if a black candidate was going to win, precincts that were changed at the last second, and voting centers, and some people were told and some people were not. Example after example from state after state. And Roberts ignores the record. He goes off his own vibe that things have changed in the South. He makes up his own standard of equal sovereignty among states, and he says the time for preclearance is gone. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has the memorable dissent in this case, and she says giving up a preclearance is like throwing away your umbrella in the rain because you're not getting wet. And she was exactly right. And really, all of the South got soaked immediately thereafter. It only took an hour for Texas to enact a voter ID bill that they had already failed preclearance, and that the state of Texas knew had been designed to block as many as 700,000 Latino citizens from voting because they lacked that specific form of ID that was now being required. So what happened here in North Carolina, was also happening in all of these other states. Things had not changed in the South. And if Roberts had his eyes open, he would have seen that all of these legislatures were awaiting his decision and getting ready for it with some of the same old poison in new bottles.
Yeah, in North Carolina, if I recall, the first time the legislature first started talking about a voter ID bill in February of 2013, but they didn't move anything until that summer when the Supreme Court gave them the green light to enact this voter suppression bill. I wonder too, I'm thinking back to a couple of folks who were involved in that, crafting that legislation in 2013. One of them was State Representative Tom Murray, who is actually running for a seat on the Court of Appeals right now. I think he thinks that people have forgotten that he was the guy pushing this law that was struck down for targeting Black voters. But now he could have a seat on the Court of Appeals, which is a really important court here in North Carolina in Raleigh. Another person that was in the room when that bill was crafted was Thomas Farr. He was a lawyer for Jesse Helms back in the day. He defended Jesse Helms when he was accused of discriminating against Black voters. Jesse Helms had mailed out these postcards telling people not to vote or some incorrect information about voting. Real old school voter suppression. Thomas Farr was in the room for that. And then he was in the room in 2013. He tried to defend this bill in court later as well. He didn't succeed because the bill, like I said, was mostly struck down. But after all that happened, Donald Trump tried to put him on federal courts here in North Carolina. He was going to be in the Eastern District of North Carolina, which, as y'all know, is where a lot of the Black population in North Carolina is. And he met really relentless opposition from voting rights activists, probably some folks here in this room speaking out about that back then. And his nomination didn't go forward. He was one of the very few nominees that we managed to stop from Donald Trump. So we had some really good news on that front, at least when it came to Thomas Farr. But unfortunately, at the U.S. Supreme Court, I think Trump had a lot more luck installing his preferred judges. Can you talk a little bit about the future of the Supreme Court? I mean, are we going to get any? Is there going to be any way to check this out of control court?
We either find a way to reform it or we live with it for the next generation, maybe longer. So I think we have to start these conversations now. I'm glad they're underway. A lot of people believe these conversations had to start a lot sooner. And gratefully, the president came forth with some modest reforms on ethics codes and on term limits, which people talk as if these are huge, massive structural fixes. They have approval from upwards of 75% of Americans, over 70% of Republicans. So these are popular fixes, and we should move on them. This court is a 9-person supermajority that is unelected, that's been handed lifetime appointments, that meets in private, that has no ethics code, no accountability, and has effectively given itself veto power. So does it need an ethics code? So we know who's funding their kids' college tuition or buying their mom's houses or sending them on luxury vacations halfway around the world? Yeah, I would kind of like to know who is lining their pockets while also having interests before the court. that seems important. Justice Gorsuch has a book out now as well, and he was out the other day with an interview, and he said, be careful about this. And it sounded like a little bit of a threat. He said, boy, an ethics code would really threaten judicial independence. And I guess I've got a different sense of judicial independence than Justice Gorsuch, who folks spent, Leonard Leo and his allies spent $10 million keeping that seat warm when Merrick Garland was appointed to it in February of 2016. They spent another $10 million to install him in that seat the following year, and he's handsomely rewarded the investment by tearing down the regulatory state ever since. So judicial independence, okay. Be careful. All right, I think everything needs to be on the table. And if we don't have everything on the table, this court has told us what it is. And if we don't listen and act, we are effectively acquiescing. Lincoln in his first inaugural, said that if the Supreme Court is to become the sole determinant of all issues of import, that the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. And he was right in 1861, and he's right now.
Interesting. I think Lincoln also, I believe, signed a bill that changed the size of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Amen. Which is something we used to do every once in a while. Maybe we could think about doing that again.
Let's do it.
And I guess I want to say too, in North Carolina, up until a few years ago, we had a pretty good state Supreme Court that did a pretty good job protecting our voting rights here in North Carolina. They outlawed gerrymandering for about a year or so. They struck down a voter ID law for about a year or so. But they also kept the legislature from taking over the Board of Elections, which is really important. They're still fighting to take over the Board of Elections, but they haven't been able to do that, at least for this election. But who knows what's going to happen in the future. So I will say, at least in North Carolina, we have an enforceable ethics code for our justices, theoretically. But unfortunately, they sort of have the final word on when it comes to, they're sort of policing themselves, and they don't really do much, at least when it comes to the Republican justices. They really kind of turned a blind eye. There was a report from ProPublica a couple of months ago about the Judicial Standards Commission, which is the agency that enforces ethics rules, recommending sanctions for these two Republican judges who admitted that they had violated the rules. And the state Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to impose any sanctions on these folks. And at the same time, they were going after Anita Earls with a bogus ethics investigation. And her alleged violation of the rules was just talking about bias and discrimination in the courts. They said she was, suggesting that other judges were biased was like a violation of the rules. And she was just talking about her experience in the court and what she had seen in the court with respect to how certain lawyers were treated. So we've got our problems in North Carolina, no doubt about it. But the good thing is that in North Carolina, we don't have life tenure for our state Supreme Court. We, the people, get to decide who sits on our state Supreme Court. And this year, we get the chance to re-elect Justice Allison Riggs, who is a former civil rights lawyer. She worked at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is an organization that fought and defeated that voter suppression bill from 2013 in court. So she's been a champion of individual rights here in North Carolina for a long time. And we have the chance to re-elect Justice Anita Earls in 2018. She was the founder of the Southern Coalition. So we're really actually kind of lucky in North Carolina to have those folks on our state Supreme Court. They've written some amazing dissents in the last couple of years. And in my job at the People's Parity Project, one of the things that we do is look at who sits on our courts in different states. We recently did a report in Massachusetts where we found that most of the judges are former prosecutors or former corporate lawyers. And there aren't a lot of states where former civil rights lawyers are on the state Supreme Court. We're really lucky to have those folks. So I encourage all of y'all to talk to your friends and your family about the importance of the Supreme Court election coming up in the fall, really soon, actually. Absentee ballots are going out in the mail very soon, apparently. But I just wanted to plug that as a really important issue to keep in mind with all this. With the federal courts, it's easy to get discouraged about what we can do there. But at the local level, at least, the voters have the ultimate power, I think, with a lot of this.
I think often we forget that there's races below the presidency, and that in many ways explains how Democrats found themselves in this situation in the first place, right? There's this, it's the story in some ways I tell in the first book of a big historic election in 2008 that was then followed in 2010 by perhaps a more consequential election, because it was a redistricting year and Republicans had a plan to take state legislatures and Democrats just didn't stand up and turn out and find a way to block them in a handful of key swing states, even after they published the playbook on the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. In one of those books, I think it was Unrigged, I tell the story of Eric Holder and Obama being in the White House looking at election results not long after the 2012 election. And they were looking at North Carolina and they couldn't figure it out. They were like, what happened? We thought we had a pretty good night. And why did the legislature not come along? Why did the congressional delegation turn that way? And it didn't make any sense to them. And they had other things on their mind than thinking about a handful of state legislative races in North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. But it had to be somebody's job. And there's been long-standing consequences in so many states from losing the handful of state legislative races that year and the redistricting that has followed. And when you tie that together with a court that has thrown more and more issues back to the states, the Dobbs decision, right, in many ways is just so deeply disingenuous and ahistoric and a million other things. But Alito in that decision writes, we're not really overturning this decision. We're simply returning a contentious issue to the people and their elected representatives. No, what you're doing is you're pushing it back into gerrymandered legislatures that you yourselves allowed to be this rigged and tilted after the North Carolina case in the Supreme Court in Rucho versus Common Cause. So you get things like what happened in Wisconsin, right, where an abortion ban from 1844 goes into effect. And when the governor calls a special session of the legislature with a Marquette University poll showing that 70% of the state wants that overturned, the legislature gavels in, gavels out in less than a minute because they don't have to care. That's not returning an issue to the people and their elected representatives. So the combination of the fix being in the courts and the state legislatures works in many directions.
Yeah, in North Carolina, so in 2013, that's when the gerrymandered supermajority takes office, right? That's when they passed the voter suppression bill. There was a memo circulating among the Republicans at that time, and the title was something like, I may have the number wrong, but it was How the Republican Party Can Control North Carolina for 114 Years. That was the amount of time that the Democrats had controlled the legislature before them. And one of the things that this memo said was that it suggested that Republicans should make all these changes to judicial elections so that they could control the courts. And if they controlled the courts, they didn't have to worry about their gerrymandering being undone or their voter suppression being undone. And there was a quote in this memo that said, "Lose the courts, lose the war." And it outlined several changes that the legislature then tried to push through, including making our elections partisan again. We were the first state in almost 100 years to actually adopt partisan judicial elections. The trend had always been going the opposite direction. They also got rid of public financing for our judges. It managed to keep big money donations out of these judicial elections. People could raise a certain amount of small donations and then they would get public money. They tried to gerrymander the local elections in Charlotte, Raleigh, and some other places. They manipulated the ballots in 2018 when Anita Earls first ran for office. They passed, I think, more than one law to move her to the very bottom of the ballot. They tried to cancel the primary, all this other stuff that they tried to do to keep her off the court, but the people had the say in the end, and they put her on the court. And that year, they also rejected a couple of constitutional amendments that would have given the legislature more power. One of them would have basically allowed the legislature to pack the court. So we've seen in North Carolina what the people can do when they're motivated, and I think the first step to reining in this gerrymandered legislature is to flip the North Carolina court, the North Carolina Supreme Court. Like I was saying earlier, we got to re-elect Justice Riggs and Justice Earls, and then in 2028, they'll have a chance to get a new majority on the court, one that I hope would return us to the world of 2022, where gerrymandering was unconstitutional. And then by the time we redraw election districts, hopefully we'll have a much better situation when it comes to the courts.
It's a long-term process, but it's what had to happen in Wisconsin, right? I mean, it was a 14-year process in Wisconsin to get over the loss of a handful of state legislative seats in 2010. And you don't get those years back. You don't get the public policy back. You don't get the money that's not invested in schools and universities. It's when these non-representative bodies are entrenched for this period of time, entire election cycles just don't matter. And that really is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I know in North Carolina, really, I think a lot of the Democrats are focused on just breaking the supermajority so that Republicans can't override the governor's veto this year. And also, I want to give a shout out to Flip NC if folks are interested in getting involved in supporting Allison Riggs or the other candidates. Bree is here from Flip NC. You want to just wait for everybody? You can talk to her. She's very nice. They do canvassing and literature drops. And actually, I joined them a few weeks ago in Greensboro, talking to some folks. And I'm an introvert. I don't like talking to people, but I had a really good time. We met at a brewery, had some beers and pizza beforehand. So, yeah, flipnc.org. Check them out. They're a good time.
I approve, yes.
Well, I don't know. I guess one thing from your book, David, that we haven't really talked about that I know some folks were really interested in was this, some information that you found on Justice Lewis Powell. Folks might have heard about this Powell memo that he wrote right before he was on the U.S. Supreme Court, but there was apparently another memo that folks still didn't know about that kind of paved the way for his career.
Powell is an amazing guy. Because, and it's amazing to me how these justices who are not centrists are able to be portrayed as centrists. Powell, in many ways, was John Roberts before John Roberts. He's a Southern Virginia tobacco lawyer. He chairs the school committee in Richmond after Brown versus Board, which he's convinced was wrongly decided. But he is given credit for integrating Richmond schools anyway, simply because he didn't have maximal fight. But by the time he left in the early 1960s, you could count the number of black kids in the white schools on one hand. So he actually integrated the schools by not integrating them. He simply just didn't do it. And Powell spends the 1960s outraged about the civil rights movement, about the anti-Vietnam War movement, about radicals on campus and the media, the environmentalists. And he lives next door to a top executive at the Chamber of Commerce, and he writes the Chamber of Commerce a memo in which he says, well, if we're going to not surrender the country to the radical leftists on campus and in the media, the big business and conservatives have to fight back. And he says the best opportunity for fighting back is by taking over the courts. Lewis Powell, 3 months after delivering this memo, finds himself appointed to the US Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. So this is not just some academic memo that gets stuffed in a drawer. And Powell goes on to deliver decisions in the 1970s on voting rights, on campaign finance, that very much led the way to the Shelby County decision and also the Citizens United decision. But his memo is a key document that inspires the Koch brothers, it inspires Richard Mellon Scaife, it inspires all the folks who then pour their money into building the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, all of these big conservative research arms. There's a second memo I found that I think might have been even more influential in that it sort of follows Powell up a decade later and goes to all the same foundations. And what it says is, we're doing this wrong. We're trying to go top down. We have to go ground up. What we need to do is win hearts and minds in law schools. And this is the memo that effectively leads to the launch of the Federalist Society. Because the author of this memo, a man named Michael Horowitz, brings the founders to all of these foundations, and they give the money that effectively launches this group. I mean, as far as conservative return on investment, I don't think you could probably do any better than launching the Federalist Society. I mean, Powell is a creepy guy who was still eulogized as the Supreme Court's great Southern gentleman. I went to the Yale University Library and turned through all of his pages on that voting rights case. And there was a really important voting rights case from Mobile, Alabama that was a key to the John Roberts. I won't bore you with all of the specifics of it, but Mobile, Alabama used at-large elections still in the 1970s that effectively meant that you were always going to have an all-white council in a city that had a large black population. And a federal court judge said, no, you have to go to districts and actually draw those districts fairly so that everybody has representation and a chance at getting city resources. And the Supreme Court said, no, there's no proof that at-large districts are any more racist than anything else, really. Even though there was plenty of examples, the 1901 Alabama Constitution that effectively led to these at-large districts was passed with the goal of enshrining white supremacy by any legal means possible. This is all on the record, that there's contemporaneous letters to the editor from the 1920s in Alabama saying what the goal of at-large elections is and who it's designed to keep out of office. And I found a letter that Powell sends to Potter Stewart, who was also on the court with him, in which he says, if our side loses this case, our cities will become jungles. Which is pretty wild to see on Supreme Court letterhead, dated in your own lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's very disturbing. And I think Powell's a really interesting figure because for me, he really shows how all these reactionary forces kind of join together. He was writing that memo for the Chamber of Commerce. He was like a corporate lawyer. But he was also, working behind the scenes to thwart integration and all this stuff. So you sort of see all of these forces that were just reacting against change back then, decades ago, kind of joining together to form like the modern kind of right wing that we've dealt with, for the last several decades. Yeah, I don't know. Powell's just a fascinating figure, I think, in that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this is a story, the story of America is whether a multiracial nation can ever become a multiracial democracy. And we were founded on documents that granted those rights and liberties to people who look like us. And then after the Civil War, you get the Reconstruction Amendments that, to me, is the first attempt to really breathe life into the ideals of American democracy and extend those opportunities and freedoms to more people. Still not everybody, but to more people. And then women's suffrage follows, and the Voting Rights Act follows. But there's a backlash at each and every step of the way. The Reconstruction Amendments were effectively honored in the breach. And the problem there, again, is the US Supreme Court in a handful of cases in the 1870s, the Civil Rights Act cases, the Cruikshank cases. Again, we don't have to get into the specifics of all of these, but what the court said in these cases was that, well, the federal government's not going to enforce these amendments. We're going to leave it up to these state legislatures to enforce these. And those state legislatures had absolutely no intention of enforcing it. And that's what leads, effectively, to a century of Jim Crow, which it then takes the Voting Rights Act and preclearance to unravel. And when you go back and you look at the court decisions in the 1870s, and I don't want to sound crazy here, but the themes and the language are identical to what Roberts is writing in Shelby County. In these cases in the 1870s, they are saying, well, how long does this have to go on anyway? Haven't we already established equality? How long must certain people be favored in the eyes of the law? I believe that's the exact quote. And it's that same impatience with equality that you see in Shelby County. That same question that Roberts asks of how long do we have to do this? He says in the oral arguments of this case, it's beginning to look as if this is going to go on forever. And it's that same notion of equal sovereignty that is being used in 1873, that's being used in 2013. There's a through line here, and it's an impatience with securing a multiracial democracy, and it's the fight that we still have, and it's the fight we have yet to win.
Do you think, I love the way you're framing this, whether a multiracial nation can become a multiracial democracy. Do you think that the anti-democratic forces out there feel like the clock is ticking for them in terms of demographic change and things like that coming to America? And it seems like the more time passes, the more anti-democratic they become, because they sort of see that coming.
Yes, I think all of this stems from weakness and fear. But it's also been very effective for a very long period of time, and I don't think they believe that they're going to lose anytime soon. They're very good at kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, they're not good at accepting it when they do lose. So,
That too.
It seems like they're bloating. In part, of course. I mean, the fear is there, but you mentioned the energy vibe that the extreme right has, and that's lacking in among liberals, some kind of unity and get some vibe going. Awareness has to do with it.
People don't want to give up power. They don't want to give up power. Roberts knew exactly what he was doing. He doesn't want a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, and some of the judges, I mean, like Sam Alito just seems like fundamentally, unconcerned with what anybody wants. That's not on the Supreme Court. I mean, we heard those like recordings of him talking at the Supreme Court Historical Society fundraiser. Yeah, where he's just talking. I mean, he's talking like somebody on Fox News or something about our side winning and their side losing. He's just such a hack. It's really crazy to see, and it is like they're flaunting it or something. I don't know.
They're protected.
Any questions? Anything we can take on? Yeah.
How do you move the institutionalists on the Democratic side to go for real reform, right? We know, we can name a million people, but the first name that comes to mind for me in terms of pushing this is someone like Elliot Stahl, who's very clear-headed about what we should be doing, and yet there's sort of no real audience for that, and it almost feels like when Kamala talks about this issue right now, it's just to sort of keep a coalition together and not have another group potentially drop away or be less motivated to vote or turn people out or canvass because we've got all this momentum right now. But I feel like even if we hold the Senate, win the House, and Kamala wins, I don't think we're going to see something in the first 100 days about this. So if that's the case, how do we move our side? I know what we're fighting against. I know what that looks like. I'm not sure I know how to beat it, but I understand it. What do we do about our side?
I think there's been some progress, that we're even having this conversation with Schumer and Biden being two ultimate institutionalists, slowly coming around to understand that this is necessary. But it's going to take a lot of public pressure. I mean, and I think Harris understands that this court will undo anything she does. She won't have a presidency, even if she wins. This court will stop and block using. After the decision in the Chevron deference case, and the court can effectively do whatever it wants with the administrative state these days. A major questions doctrine, which allows it to effectively weigh in on any question it wants. I think she needs to understand that court reform is crucial to herself having a successful presidency. And unless that happens, I mean, it's got to move in the first 100 days, right? And I think we all hope that voting rights would move in the first 100 days of the trifecta in 2021, and it didn't. You had Manchin and Sinema that blocked it, and I'm not sure that there was any way to get it past a filibuster anyway. But it's going to take a real determination to push through real change quickly. And if she doesn't hold the Senate, imagine, if Democrats don't hold the Senate, I think it's really easy to imagine that she doesn't get any picks to the court, even if anything opens. They blocked Garland in 2016. I don't think they'd have any problem at all if Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito died of just holding that seat open for 4 years instead of 1 if they held the Senate, right? Even John McCain in 2016, it was like, I'm going to make sure Hillary Clinton doesn't get any picks on the Supreme Court. So we have to hold the Senate. We have to win the House, and this kind of reform, big structural reform, has to be priority 1. And don't even get me started on how we have to fix the entire Senate.
Yeah, talk to your member of Congress and senator about this for sure. And I'll also say, there are steps that Congress can take short of term limits or something like that. Congress, for example, can change the court's jurisdiction. That's something I think I would love to see Congress do, is think about some of these cases involving abortion rights or voting rights, and can we pass a law saying the U.S. Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over those cases? Congress hasn't passed a law like that in a long time, but
Could.
But it could easily, yeah.
So what is the precedent for stuff like that? Because, if the Supreme Court is illegitimate in the eyes of the people and public perception is what it is, what's to stop Congress or the president from saying, like, this is the law of the land, if you don't like it, go F yourself. This is what the people have decided. Has that happened historically, or?
Well, Robert said, too bad, I mean, that's a little bit
Yeah, I mean,
off point there, but
the court gets to say what the law is. I mean, that's in our three branches of government. That's what they do. I mean, they interpret the Constitution, and they kind of get the final say on that. I mean, I think to the extent that we've seen other branches of government defying the courts, it's often people on the right. I mean, if you look at like
Ohio.
in Ohio, with the gerrymandering fight that they had, that was really disgusting. In North Carolina, I mean, we've had so many court orders about education funding, and the legislature just, maybe we'll get to it one day. But I don't know that I've really seen that kind of thing coming from the left, though. I don't.
So that's an area that I'm concerned about too. And we haven't talked at all about political violence. And not that I espouse that at all, but there's a willingness, certainly for those on the right, to think that that's okay. So rather than go as far as that extreme, are there elements of the tools that the right have now enabled that should be used by those on the left to block or handle? So to wit, if the president is acting in the interest of their responsible duties, are there things potentially could happen in the next few months that could be beneficial and should be fought through? Are we given tools because of what has happened, either at the state level or at the national level, that we're ignoring because there's a sense of fair play and we adhere to the rules that we are wrong to ignore?
Like the president has immunity now.
The president, if they're acting in their responsible duties, has an opportunity to influence change in a way that they hadn't had before.
Right.
But, yes.
Not if his name is Biden
So,
or Harris.
so is there any legitimacy to the efforts to impeach members of the Supreme Court? Is there any way that could actually happen?
You'd need 67 members of the Senate to make it happen.
Forget that.
So it's not going to
forget
happen.
it completely.
But should we normalize the idea of talking about their corruption? 100% yes. Because this is a corrupt court that is enriching itself from people who have interests before the court, from people who have helped create the ideological capture of this court. And we should be holding hearings. We talk about what can we do? We ought to be holding hearings. We ought to be subpoenaing all of these people and forcing them to testify. I mean, let's have Leonard Leo hauled before Congress. Let's really get to the bottom of this and what happened. Let's see Harlan Crow testify. Let's see these folks, Paul Singer and all of these folks who have donated so much money. Let's investigate and get to the bottom of it.
So why doesn't a Sheldon Whitehouse do that? Sheldon Whitehouse talks a good game.
Yeah, he gets it.
But
He's not chair of judiciary.
Right. He's not able to, he can't make that happen from where he is. He doesn't have enough.
White House has done a lot of good things,
Yeah.
but I mean, as long as Durbin controls judiciary, I don't think he's going,
Okay.
unless if Durbin changes.
Right.
There's an institutionalist
Right.
who we need to find a way to impact.
And I will say the House has an oversight function too. They don't have as much control over judges, but they can hold hearings and get Leonard Leo, subpoena, and all those other folks. And
If they're a majority, though.
Right. Yeah, if there's a Democratic majority, and they could also start the process for impeachment. They're not going to get the Senate to vote to remove, but they could at least talk about it and start the process there.
I've got a question just about voter turnout. American engagement in politics is so low compared to very many other countries. How much could we solve if we solve that? Are we getting the government we deserve because we just aren't voting? And I feel like it's not just about particular categories of voters, but it's across many categories.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what we need to have are more elections that matter, that people feel that they need to turn out for. I mean, we're in the middle of a presidential election right now, and unless you live in one of 7 states, and this happens to be one of them, I mean, there's not a whole lot of point in turning out. I can sort of see that, especially if the lines are long and you can't have any water. You know, and it's complicated. You put enough blockades in front of people, and there's not enough on the ballot that actually seems like it's meaningful, because the congressional race has been determined through gerrymandering, and the local legislative races aren't super competitive. I mean, we're at a point now where there's only about 2 or 3 dozen competitive congressional seats in the country out of 435. There's a handful of competitive Senate races, but it's going to come down to really just Montana is the one that probably matters the most. I think more competitive elections would go a long way towards increasing voter turnout, fixing some of these structural questions, maybe gets us, in that direction.
I did see Carolina Forward published an interesting bar graph the other day, kind of comparing the percentage that each presidential candidate got to the percentage of people that didn't vote, and sort of counting did not vote as like its own vote for president. And they said that 2020 was the first year when a candidate got more votes than the did not vote category. So I think we've seen in the last couple of elections at least that more and more people are engaged. I think I hope that means in North Carolina that more people are engaged in voting in races down the ballot, where we do see these really narrow margins in some of these races. In 2020, Sherry Beasley lost the Chief Justice position by 401 votes. So in these elections in North Carolina, every vote is
401.
Yeah.
It's closer than Florida in 2000.
Yeah, it's wild. It's the closest election, I think, in history. It's a statewide election. Yeah. And we've all been paying for it ever since with Paul Newby.
401 votes.
Yeah, such a difference.
So they do matter, and there's always a competitive one somewhere.
And actually, if the people just in the Chapel Hill early voting sites who voted the president and skipped the Supreme Court had voted just Chapel Hill, just early voting, she would have won.
Well, that's another case of what's a trusted source of media. So are you going to trust the Democratic Party who gives you, this is the sample ballot, vote this way, versus an independent media, right?
Oh,
And the independent media has been evaporating too over time, right?
Yeah. I mean, they just didn't vote it.
But they didn't know. They didn't
As
know.
the parent of young adults, they're sort of too lazy to research the down ballot races. They just don't. I mean, where are they going to hear about it? They don't read the same stuff we read, and they're busy and blah, blah, blah. They just, I hate to admit it, but my own kids are guilty of that.
But it's not just young adults. I mean, how many people really know about the Agricultural Commission rates? We can hit things like the insurance. We are a room full of very high information voters in this room, high impact, high information.
Trucks are all the way.
You go past, but you go literally like 50 yards beyond this room, throw a baseball as far as you can throw it, and you can find people who don't know why we even have insurance. Right?
It's true. I used to go work the poll, like every year I would work the polls in my precinct, and I'd be out there handing out stuff or whatever, and friends from the neighborhood would come up to me, very highly educated friends. Who should I vote for school board? Who should I vote for county commissioner? Because they knew I had done the research. And I'm just telling them, people used to call me the kingmaker for Southern Village because I would. But isn't that sad that these people with master's degrees, they didn't bother to research it, and then, I'll just ask somebody I trust,
People have the power if they choose to use it. But
Yeah.
if they choose to not right? We have all these, call them distractions, call them whatever you want. We have all these other things that capture our attention in society. And the reason people turned out more in 2020 and 2016 is because Trump captures people's attention, positive and negative ways, right? You come to vote against him, you come to vote for him, you come to vote against his opponent, whatever it is. That's why turnout was bigger in 2020, 2016, and also in between. 2022 had a huge turnout because of Dobbs in lots of places. Turnout's up because people are pissed off, just like they still are in this race. And Biden being out of the way means now the Democrats who had energy and are like, have energy again. So yeah, I think we're gonna have to tell them who to vote for when they show up on election day or early voting and hand them blue ballots and say, please use this. That's the way it goes.
They have to care. I mean, my son who doesn't want to bother to research, he texted me when the UNC Board of Governors got rid of all the DEI offices. He was so upset. What can we do? What can we do? And I was like, you can pay attention and you can vote, but like until it's something they care about.
I mean, all we can do is just kind of like tell the people in our circles, I did a little like short Facebook video about the Supreme Court election in 2022. I'll do that again this year. I hate doing that, but a few hundred people see it more than like if I just post something on Facebook. So I think we've got to meet people where they're at when it comes to this kind of thing. And I mean, for so many people, that's on social media, with these little videos.
And the kids are more politically aware. I hear what you're saying intergenerationally, but I also have kids who are going to vote for the first time in this election. The amount of stuff they share with me off of TikTok, the amount of, you can smile and laugh about it. It is so political on TikTok.
I'm smiling because I know.
And it's good. Like, they get good information.
And they have
Is
to get it down to 30 seconds.
You right, but you know what? It's also 30 seconds of text.
Yeah.
It's not just, and so we can dismiss these things because they aren't our things, right?
Oh,
the
we
same
gotta
way
do more of that.
right, but like my parents, their parents dismiss them for listening to Beatles or whatever. Guess what? TikTok's really powerful.
Yeah.
It's powerful in ways that matter in terms of mobilization on issues that we care about, be it guns, be it abortion, be it trans rights, like all that stuff. TikTok is an engine for 15 to 30-year-olds.
So I have a question. As a journalist, the burden that we're carrying as journalists is that we have to teach and write with an impartial lens. And when you have subject matter that leans in a direction that is not in the middle, how do you survive as a journalist when that's your perspective?
I think you're honest about your political perspective. I mean, I was the editor of Salon. I don't think there's really any doubt as far as where I stand on these questions. But when I say that this court is anti-democratic, I don't say that it's anti-democratic because I disagree with it. I think it's anti-democratic because it is part of the American backlash to the idea of multiracial democracy and the full spirit of the Reconstruction Amendments, which to me is the highest sustaining ideal of what American democracy can and should be. And if I'm not an impartial journalist for believing that, then that's fine. I'll turn my card in, but I have had to get, I interview Republican after Republican, conservative after conservative in this book. I sit down with Edward Bloom in a chapter. I sit down with Michael Horowitz of the Horowitz memo. I found all these people, all these folks who were involved in the creation of originalism in the Reagan Justice Department, people who worked with John Roberts in Reagan's DOJ. And they all talk to me. This is a deeply reported book that talks to the multiple former attorney generals and federal judges and members of Congress and folks who are involved in all of these efforts. I don't think they talk to me if they thought they were talking to some partisan hack. I think you have to do the work and be honest about it and not have your thumb on the scale. I'm just as critical of Democrats when they do things that I think are anti-small d democratic. And I think as long as you're kind of bring that same level of scrutiny and honesty to it, that's a whole lot better than the sort of both sides nonsense that sort of passes for objectivity these days, and that I think has gotten us into a lot of trouble.
We're on the same page.
Had a feeling.
Can you tell us a little bit about Fair Vote and what it does and what you're doing with them?
Sure. Fair Vote works largely on questions of ranked choice voting. Probably people in the room know what ranked choice voting is, so I won't dive into the explanation. But I mean,
It's a different system, right?
What?
It's a different system.
Yeah, you simply put choices in order, and it's a series of instant runoffs until you get to a winner with majority support. And you know, I mean, I think majority rule is a good thing,
Yeah.
and choice is a good thing. And when you have as many non-competitive elections as we have, it pushes everything into the party primary, and you might have 12 people running in the primary, and there's no polling, and you're almost voting blind in a race like that. And somebody comes away and wins it with 22% of the vote, who's got no incentive to talk to anybody else, just to sort of try to motivate and outrage the easiest 22% of the base in an August primary. And then you coast into office, and then you go to Raleigh or Washington, and you've got no incentive to do anything but pay attention to those people. If you have to talk to more people, if you have to ask someone to I know you're with them as your first choice, but I'd like to be your second choice, it gives you have to try to find a way to 51. And that, to me, makes a lot more sense. It's entirely possible this presidential race could be tipped by third-party candidates in some of these states. I mean, if it comes down to, whether Chase Oliver gets 0.8 or 0.6 in Georgia, that's not great. If Michigan comes down to whether Jill Stein gets 1.1% or 0.8%, and that tips the entire presidency, that is not exactly majority rule.
If Perot had not run in 1992, I think Bill Clinton would have lost. What if
it depends. The political science on that seems to suggest that vote would have divided up pretty equally. But I mean, Nader certainly, yeah. I mean, Nader certainly tipped Florida, right? It was only 530.
So
There's only 537 votes in Florida.
Gore won Florida, though. We know if they count, Gore actually won just the votes that were there. Gore won those votes. There's a lot of research into that in the aftermath. There's a lot of political science research. The court stopped the count.
A lot of.
And it seems, and again, I'm not trying to give Nader a pass. Lots of reasons to be upset with Nader, but
I'm not giving
it was a
him.
miscount, and that one.
I mean, Gore lost debates to George Bush. He picked Joe Lieberman.
He could have won
But that one
he didn't win his home state.
But it also
lots of things.
That one rested SCOTUS' door more than Nader's door by about 1,000 times.
Agreed. Butterfly ballots in Palm Beach. There were lots of irregularities down there. Catherine Harris.
Republican lawyers in Miami did.
The
I was wondering what
Brooks Brothers riot.
people thought about the Democratic National Convention and how that might fit in with what we're talking about here. The Republican Crenshaw, who's on Bill Maher, said Democrats put on a good show, they're just lousy politics.
It's a good line.
I saw the first 3 nights, I couldn't see them. Well, just haven't gotten around to it. The first 3 nights I thought were impressive. Good show and good speeches. I've recommended a lot of high school kids and people I meet in bars, other places, and you're in public school students. When you're public speaking, there are some great speeches.
Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be back in Chapel Hill. Great to see you. Thank you. Thank you, Daley.